Gothic 1 is one of the best RPGs of all time, being most renowned for its immersive open-world design that created a truly believable setting, from the way the environments looked to the way the human settlements operate and the way the local wildlife behaves, with a truly unique atmosphere and some really compelling gameplay mechanics that have largely stood the test of time 20-some years after its original release in 2001. One aspect that hasn't aged very well, unfortunately, and which can make it a difficult game for newcomers to get into, is its control scheme. In truth, this isn't so much a matter of the controls aging poorly over time, but of them being somewhat weird and idiosyncratic even back when the game was brand new. Back in 2001, the industry hadn't really settled on a particular standard for how these types of third-person action-adventure games should be controlled. Although popular first-person shooters like Half-Life and Counter-Strike were popularizing the idea of WASD controls for movement and mouse control for the camera, that hadn't made its way into other genres as a prevalent thing when Gothic 1 was being developed in the mid to late 90s, when games like the Tomb Raider series were still relying on keyboard-only control schemes, with the right hand controlling your movement on the arrow keys and the left hand operating various other commands on the keyboard. So Gothic followed suit with a control scheme somewhat similar to precedents established by Doom and Tomb Raider, where the keyboard was seemingly the main focus and the mouse was merely a peripheral option. Mouse control in Gothic 1 is not great, to put it gently, with its really low sensitivity, the way your character has to slowly turn when you look left or right, and some awkward interactions between your movement keys and the camera control, like when strafing or how you have to press and hold extra keys to look around with the camera without also moving your character. It therefore became a common practice for people to disregard the mouse altogether and play exclusively on the keyboard, where the game's more tank-like control scheme feels a little more appropriate for the input methodology. Where things get really weird is its action selection system, where nearly every action in the game requires you to use the action button in conjunction with your movement keys. When you want to pick an item up off the ground, you don't just press the action button by itself. You need to press and hold the action button and then press your forward key. The same principle applies to talking with NPCs, opening treasure chests, climbing ladders, lying down on beds to rest, and so on, with you always needing to press action and forward to do any simple action in the game. This doesn't make intuitive sense at first, as we've been conditioned in most other games to expect a single press of the action button to execute all of these different types of actions depending on the context, and yet for some reason Gothic 1 expects you to do twice as much work by pressing two buttons simultaneously. Worse yet is there's nowhere in-game that actually explains this concept to you, as the settings menu only lists a simple action button, and so it's often a first-time experience for new players to be stuck wandering around the starting area, struggling to comprehend why they can't pick an item up off the ground or interact with a simple treasure chest. In the game's defense, it does give you a README file on the main install path which does explain this to you as the literal very first thing in its contents, and I would presume the printed user manual would as well, although my North American edition didn't come with a physical manual. So the information is there if you think to check for it, especially if you were an active gamer in this era and were familiar with the concept of README files or accustomed to reading the manual while the game installed, but it still would have helped for there to be some kind of notation for this in the in-game controls window. So that may be a case of 3 strikes you're out for some people, between the poor mouse support, weirdness of needing 2 button presses to perform basic actions, and then not effectively communicating this to the player, which might lead some to quit the game altogether before even leaving the starting area. Even for those who figure it out and persist further in their playthrough, it can still feel a little cumbersome in the early goings, which can potentially sour one's enjoyment of the game overall. While I admit that these can be legitimate frustrations, I find that once you get used to everything, the controls in Gothic 1 are actually really intuitive and simple to use, with some aspects that actually contribute towards the game's already strong feeling of immersion, better than if you didn't need that extra directional input when performing actions. You see, it goes beyond just needing to press action and forward to perform a basic action, as there's an entire logical system to using all 4 directional inputs to perform relevant actions depending on the specific context of what you're doing. For instance, when you go to loot a chest, holding the action button brings your character down to interact with it, and then pressing up will raise the chest lid to peer inside, and pressing down will close the lid, thus mimicking the physical action of the lid opening and closing and the motions your character is taking within the game space. Releasing the action button then disengages your character from the chest. While actually peering inside the chest, you use the action button in conjunction with the left and right directions to move items between the chest's inventory on the left of the screen with your inventory on the right side of the screen, thus matching the directional presentation of the interface screens. It's a similar system when grilling meat on a frying pan. You hold the action button to interact with the pan and then press forward to put meat on the pan, a motion that involves moving it forward and away from your character, and then press back to take it off the pan, thus moving it back towards you, and release the action button to disengage from the pan. The same thing happens with doors. You press the action button to engage the handle, then forward to open it, back to close it, and left and right to try picking the lock. Even combat follows this pattern. You press action to engage your sword, then press forward to do forward strikes, left to strike to the left, right to strike to the right, and back to go into a guard stance to block an attack. There's an elegant way in which the controls tie specific actions to more specific inputs while still keeping the array of controls relatively small and limited, so much so that you can comfortably play the entire game with one hand. You don't have to memorize a dozen different buttons with each specific button being assigned to its own input, as you can perform most basic actions in the game, from interacting with the world to engaging with the combat system, with primarily just the action button and directional keys, most of which make completely logical sense in context. Using the game's directional input system for inventory management, for example, where you just press the action button in conjunction with the logically appropriate direction, is a faster, more straightforward process than something like pressing the action button to select an item and then cycling through command prompts to select what you want to do with it before pressing the action button again. It also eliminates the need for extra visual elements in the user interface, which is one less thing standing between you and the game world that reminds you you're playing a video game, which can help with the immersion just a tiny bit. Considering how minimalistic the entire interface system is, I suspect that may have been a primary intention in the game design, to not have a bunch of UI elements distracting you from the actual in-game world. Those multi-input directional controls can do a whole world of small wonders for the game's immersion by making you feel more closely connected to it simply with the way your inputs are actually translated within the game space. And mind you, Gothic is not the only game to implement directional controls like this. Developer Frictional Games, for example, uses it a lot in their games for the express purpose of adding extra immersion to the experience, or something like Amnesia makes you click and drag the mouse in different directions depending on the context, which can instill a stark mechanical difference in the user experience when you're running away from a scary monster and need to push or pull a door open, versus just clicking once to automatically open the door in the correct direction. So it's not like these concepts are unique to Gothic or inherently bad on principle alone, as they have been used successfully in other games as well. I'll also mention that having these kinds of multi-input directional distinctions allows you to engage with the game more directly and with more deliberate intent than if everything were a single button press or the action button by itself automatically does everything all on its own, which can lead to your character doing things you might not have intended by virtue of vague context and less user-defined control parameters. For example, Gothic 2 streamlined the controls by eliminating the directional inputs for most things, which made the simple act of jumping way less fluid and immersive. In Gothic 1, if you wanted to climb a ledge, you could hold the jump button to first gauge if your character could actually climb the ledge before committing to the jump. If you could, then the camera would pan up to indicate that you could grab onto it. If the camera didn't do that, then you knew you couldn't reach the ledge and could release the jump button without committing to the jump. In Gothic 2, that system is completely gone, which leads to a lot of awkward guessing where you press the jump button near a ledge that looks climbable, and then watch as your character jumps in place with his arms outstretched, not grabbing onto the thing you were trying to grab, sometimes even awkwardly bouncing off the collision meshes and making you fall off the ledge you were already safely on. In this particular instance, at least, the more streamlined controls gave you less direct control over your character, which makes basic tasks like trying to climb something awkward and frustrating when the controls don't do what you expect them to, all because you have less direct control over them. In a similar vein, without having the opportunity to hold the action button to focus on something before committing to the action, it's easier to perform accidental inputs like sitting on a stool when you meant to pick something off a table, or stealing an item instead of talking to someone. The directional combinations also help to ensure that relatively few actions have overlapping functions in similar contexts. The only place this gets somewhat cumbersome is in combat, where the directional inputs serve as both movement and different types of attacks or blocks, which prevents you from moving and attacking at the same time, with the sole exception of the forward charge attack. But it's really not that hard to hold the action button when you want to attack and release it when you want to move or turn. It's not like in Risen 2, for example, where space is jump, dodge, and riposte, and left click is attack and parry, where you have multiple inputs on the same button where your character can do wildly different things while you perform the exact same input. At least in Gothic, the controls are consistent and will do exactly what you tell them to, so it's your own fault if you press the wrong input and do the wrong thing. It's just a matter of getting used to it and developing the right muscle memory to do it quickly and consistently. Its biggest issue is mainly the fact that it starts you out with such crappy animations as a result of being completely untrained in sword combat, with your character holding a one-handed sword with two hands and awkwardly swinging it like a baseball bat. But the system opens up considerably and becomes much more fluid with longer, faster, and more effective combos as soon as you learn your first level of combat training. Once you get the hang of things, and especially once you learn some combat training, the combat actually has a really snappy responsiveness to it, with being able to quickly strafe around enemies to avoid attacks or to weave in and out of opponents, and swift attack animations that play out within a fraction of a second of pressing the button. Needing to time your attacks in rhythm to maintain a consistent combo, and watching your spacing and positioning to avoid damage also go a long way towards making the combat much more mechanically engaging, just with the way you have to engage the controls to ensure success. This combat system really was ahead of its time, considering how slow and awkward melee combat systems were in other 3D action RPGs of that era. In a way, it's a bit like a crude, early prototype of what the Dark Souls games would eventually evolve into, which is high praise for a small development team in 2001. Ranged combat unfortunately suffers by virtue of its lock-on auto-attack system where you don't get any opportunity to aim your attacks, but that's more of a byproduct of the lack of proper mouse support, which I don't think they were expecting to be part of the game when they started developing it in 1996 or 1997. For a game seemingly built on keyboard-only controls, the lock-on auto-attack aiming for ranged weapons is probably preferable to having to aim attacks manually with the keyboard in a 3D space, but there's no denying it would have been better with proper mouse aiming. With all of that being said, the controls do have some legitimate faults that I can't defend. The slow turning speed and general tank-like control scheme can feel pretty clunky, if not unresponsive at times when you need your character to move a little faster or more precisely. Locking onto specific targets and switching between multiple targets can be finicky, if not downright impossible in certain situations, which can make fighting against groups a little frustrating. Navigating through your inventory can be a tedious hassle as you get later into the game when you have long lists that only display in a single column that you have to scroll through to find what you need, and there are a lot of hidden control features that the game doesn't tell you about, beyond just the fact that you need to combine the action key with the directional buttons. Like, for example, that you can dive and swim underwater by using the jump button instead of the action button, or that you can move larger stacks of items by using the strafe keys instead of the normal directional keys, among other things. This is all, of course, in addition to the aforementioned lack of proper mouse support. But for all the flack Gothic 1's controls get from new players for being supposedly bad or broken or unintuitive, I find they're actually quite logical once you understand how they work, and they become pretty responsive once you get the hang of actually executing them. There's even some hidden benefits to the sense of immersion with just being able to have more direct control over your character and with the way the controls translate to the actual on-screen action. And of course, you're always free to remap all of the key bindings to whatever configuration you like, which I was sure to do on my very first playthrough. So I've never considered Gothic 1's controls to be an actual flaw in the game design, and they never hampered my ability to enjoy the game, except for a little bit early on while I was getting accustomed to all of the novelties. And then I came to really appreciate them, and actually found myself missing certain features in Gothic 2 when it switched to a more streamlined control system. Gothic 1's controls are certainly not perfect, and indeed there is a steeper learning curve than usual with getting used to its idiosyncrasies, but they're absolutely better than their reputation, and shouldn't be regarded as an impediment to enjoying the game for anyone with the patience to actually learn a new control scheme.